right, we have with us today for a segment on a topic of the U.S. funding terrorism with Jim Jatras. He's a government media relations former U.S. diplomat, GOP Senate foreign policy advisor, and has been around the area. We're talking in the Mideast, Russia, in the areas, and he has been there, studied, saw, and I like to get his opinion on things because he's a thinker and with experience on the ground. He tweeted out basically where I found him, this topic, is he tweeted out about an article that was written, and you can get to his tweet at Jim Jatras, be at Jim Jatras. There's his account there on Twitter. I'd advise getting it on there. Very good points that stand counter to the mainstream, and yet it's not. It's an independent mind that uses critical thinking, which is not really. It's kind of rare in the media these days. So let me welcome Jim Jatras back to Feet to the Fire. Welcome. Oh, it would help to turn on your sound. We have the link up here to this article that you tweeted. So let's go to that and start in on it. How it's on the AmericanConservative.com website, how America armed terrorists in Syria. And if you would like to bring up some points about that.
Sure. Well, to start with, Gareth Porter, the author of the article, is a very well-known, distinguished journalist, writes for a number of outlets, including Consortium News and the American Conservative. I think the main point of this article is that there's, to be honest, for those of us who've been following this for some time, there's not a whole lot of new information in there, but he has really assembled in one place what has been a very consistent pattern for the past almost 6 years now, since the Syrian war began in 2011, of outside support for groups in Syria that we know are terrorist groups that are either part of al-Qaeda or some offshoots of al-Qaeda, or eventually one of them which developed into what they call the Islamic State, also known as ISIS, ISIL, Daesh. And this was done knowingly. This was done as a deliberate element of geopolitics, that for whatever reason we need to get rid of Assad, we want to counter the Russians or the Iranians, we need to give weapons to these so-called moderate groups that we know are not moderate. They are in fact al-Qaeda. And one of the things he points out, for example, was something, again, that people knew who had been following this, but you never see it really discussed in the mainstream media from either the Republicans or the Democrats, is what really happened at Benghazi, that was not a consulate. It was an embassy annex that was involved in a CIA operation to run weapons from Gaddafi's stocks to the jihadists in Syria, and then things got out of hand, and 4 Americans got killed. But that was the nature of the operation there. One thing that Mr. Porter talks about in his article that I had not been aware of was the taking weapons from a number of countries in Central Europe and the Balkans, including some stocks left over from the Balkan Wars of the 1990s, and this involved Croatia, Serbia, Czech Republic, a number of other countries, that these weapons were also transported by the CIA to so-called moderates in Syria, who are anything but moderates, that they have vastly strengthened al-Qaeda in Syria. And a lot of it gets down to the question of why are we doing this and what can we do to stop it? And Mr. Porter begins his article with reference to a bill that's pending in the Congress calling the Stop Arming Terrorists Act. It's introduced in the House by Tulsi Gabbard, a Democrat from Hawaii, and in the Senate by Rand Paul, Republican of Kentucky. And it's pretty straightforward. It means no American money can be used to arm either al-Qaeda, one would think that would be obvious, or the Islamic State, ISIS, again, that would be obvious, or any groups that are collaborating or allied with them. This means Ahrar al-Sham, Jaish al-Islam, and all these other Sunni Wahhabist terrorist groups that are allied with primarily with al-Qaeda. It also means, and this is probably where the real rub comes in, that we would also cut off weapons to other countries that are funding them. And as we know, over the last 6 years, the Saudis, the Qataris, the Turks, and several other countries have been providing weapons to these very same groups. And I think one of the things we need to keep in mind is that when we aid radical Islamic terrorist groups, when we give them weapons, when we give them money, that increases the threat of terrorism here in the United States. And I don't mean in the conventional sense of blowback. We make people angry and they come back and hit us. What I mean is, if you strengthen terrorist groups, you get more terrorism. And you build the platform that they then can use to strike us back here in the United States. So I think that Mr. Porter and the American Conservative have done the public a great service here. I don't know how much attention this article will get in Washington among policymakers who have been very resistant to the notion that we need literally an act of Congress to stop this arms supply to terrorist groups in Syria. But I hope it's something that people pay attention to and will spur some action.
What was I kind of liked about Tulsi Gabbard, and she actually went to the area, talked with Syria's president, and looked into things personally, and came back. Now, she got a lot of people mad at her, both Republicans and Democrats, because she was basically kind of saying that it's best to go with Assad and try to get him, knock him out, if I summarize it properly. And she caught a lot of grief on it. But I am always impressed with somebody who, A, has got eyes on the ground, and B, when they actually look at it, kind of come up with something against the grain that they normally are flowing in their party. That generally means that they've actually looked into things.
That's right, and she has done exactly that. She did go to Syria. As I understand it from her account, she did not originally intend to meet with President Assad, but ended up doing so since she was there and he offered the meeting. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. She makes a point of saying, however, she's not supporting President Assad. Her job, her concern is that we are not supporting the terrorists. And I think that makes perfect sense. You don't have to endorse Assad to say we should not be arming and funding the terrorists who are trying to overthrow him and create a terrorist state in what is now Syria. So I think a lot of the criticism that's been directed against her is tremendously unfair. It seems that she's gotten a lot more flack actually from her own party, the Democratic Party, than she has from the Republicans. If you look at her 13 co-sponsors on her bill, I believe 3 of them are Democrats and the other 10 are Republicans. But even among Republicans, she's not getting a whole lot of support. We have a lot of people saying they're concerned about the situation in Syria, particularly concerned about the Christians in Syria who are, before the war started, were about 13% of the population. It's probably less than that now because so many of them have had to flee abroad, but that you'd think you'd be able to put 2 and 2 together. If we're concerned about Christians in Syria, why are we giving weapons to radical Muslim jihadists who are killing them, enslaving them, doing all the things that we know that these groups do?
It would seem that the goal, which has been going on for a long time, with Saddam, for example, supporting him while he fought Iran, and then supporting what I guess later turned into al-Qaeda because they fought Russia and Afghanistan. It seems to be this idea of, we'll support these guys because they're fighting these other guys, but the collateral damage of what else they do isn't as important, and then they end up turning back on the U.S. plans or whatever eventually. So it seems that not a lot of thought go into this, or maybe they just don't care.
You know, I really do wonder myself whether it's they don't care or they're not thinking through, or it's a question of perspective. It seems that they're so focused on achieving A, they really don't care about what the fallout is. Look, what's the granddaddy of all blowback? It's 9/11. We give we gave all these arms and money to the Mujahideen in Afghanistan to fight the Soviet Union. Maybe that made sense at the time. It was a Cold War on communism, all of that. But we built a monster in the process, and that monster came back and hit us. And it seems that you should be able to draw some lessons from that you can't just hand out weapons like candy to dangerous people and then not expect bad things to happen afterward. And unfortunately, I think a lot of this idea is so ingrained in elements of the deep state, and let me say parenthetically, the same deep state that is working very hard to try to neutralize President Trump and I think remove him from office, that it is so ingrained in some of these agencies that, well, these people are operational. These are people who can get things done. These are useful people for geopolitical ends, that they don't really think through what the long-term consequences are. I mean, look at the late Zbigniew Brzezinski's response to, was it a good idea to aid the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, even though it turned into Al-Qaeda and came back to hit us? His answer is, of course it was the right thing to do. What's more important, overthrowing communism or a bunch of riled up Muslims? Well, maybe in the long term, a bunch of riled up Muslims will become a much bigger problem for us than we had anticipated. And I think that's a lesson that is still not learned by a lot of people here in Washington.
Yeah, I think there's too many either ors. Let's look at the multiple facets of it, that when you do start something here, you have all these effects. I wanted to go back to something I said about her supporting Assad. I guess what I meant by that was the devil you know is better than the devil you don't know, so to speak, and he is a civilian as opposed to a religious-related guy, and he does allow Christians, so to speak. I don't think his people are out after Christians. I mean, it seems like that the painting that both parties have done is painted him into this to be this mass murdering dictator, terrible type stereotype, which I'm guessing isn't as bad as it is, whatever bad may be there.
Well, to start with, as far as Bashar al-Assad goes personally, as people may know, he never wanted to be president of this country. This is not somebody who, through some vaulting ambition, like, say, Saddam Hussein in Iraq, really wanted to install himself in power. That wasn't the case of Bashar. His older brother, Basil, was the one who was being groomed by their father, Hafiz al-Assad, to be the president, and he was killed in an accident. Bashar he's an eye doctor. He was practicing in Britain when suddenly the throne became vacant, so to speak, and the Ba'athist party and the Alawite leadership. He's from the Alawite religious group in Syria, which is the most important group there. But I think people sometimes misconstrue Syria as a sectarian state, which it is not. It's a very strongly secular state, which is one reason why Christians and other minorities tend to be very supportive of the Syrian government, because they see the alternative is a very sectarian, very intolerant, not only just Sunni but Wahhabist state of the ideology that these guerrillas these terrorists are fomenting. And by the way, I put in that category many of the Sunnis in Syria. Remember, Syria is a Sunni majority country, but an awful lot of Sunnis, they don't want to live under a Sharia state. They don't want to live under a caliphate. They want to live like normal people in a normal country, and not have to put headscarves on their daughters or get whipped or killed for having a beer. And so I think there are a lot of Sunnis who want to live in a modern, secular, tolerant state, which, whatever its authoritarian tendencies might be in Syria, is that, as opposed to a sectarian state. Look, most of the soldiers in the Syrian army are Sunnis. Most of the cabinet ministers and the generals are Sunnis. The first lady is a Sunni. The idea that this is an intolerant, anti-Sunni sectarian state is simply not true. It's a national state of all Syrians, whether they're Christian or Shia or Sunni or Druze or Kurd or Alawite. And I think that's what the people supporting the government see, especially when they see what the alternative is, which is somebody who's going to cut their head off.
That's not a good alternative. So let me ask you.
Not really, not so much.
So I look at this as I'm not an educated expert in this. I'm just some a guy who's got an open mind and keeps his ears open. And I look and I see the U.S. supporting Saudi Arabia, who are Wahhabists. They're supporting, they're going against and seem to be the wrong side in Syria. It's like Russia seems to actually be going after the right terrorists. I mean, what's driving the U.S. to pick the wrong side, let's call it? Yeah, can you kind of put it in a sentence or two? Because it's amazing to me.
I don't know if I could put it in a sentence or two. I think part of it is clientitis in the sense used to call that at the State Department, clientitis, when people were infected by the view of their client country rather than what's good for the United States. And I think we unfortunately see that with respect to Saudi Arabia. But again, we need to mention Qatar and Turkey. I think we also have this notion that is just sort of ingrained in the operating code of so much of our government that Iran is the bad guy and Russia is the bad guy, so that everybody who is opposed to Iran and Russia are, quote, on our side, and they're on the other side. And you hear this all the time with respect to the Russian intervention in Syria. The idea that, well, why are the Russians in Syria? They're just there to thwart American policy. They're just playing spoiler. Look, I've talked to a lot of people on the Russian side, and I've never heard anybody who thinks in those terms. The way they tend to think of the situation in Syria is they say, look what happened in Libya when you overthrew that guy. You created a failed state. You've got terrorists running amok. Russia cannot afford to have that a long day's drive from their border. I don't know how many people watched the interview with Vladimir Putin by Oliver Stone, where Stone said in so many words, the United States has supported terrorists in Chechnya within the borders of Russia against the Russian state, along with all the other terrorists that we've supported. They tend to look at all these terrorists as all the same. You know, when they first began their intervention and started bombing terrorist groups in Syria, you heard people saying, well, the Russians are lying. They said they would go there to fight ISIS, and they're not fighting ISIS. They're fighting U.S.-supported moderates. Yeah, the U.S.-supported moderates, as we see in the article this week from Gareth Porter, they're all al-Qaeda or people who are allied with al-Qaeda. There are no moderates. I met recently with a group of bishops from Syria and Iraq and Lebanon, who they said that in so many words. When somebody asked the question about the moderate opposition, they broke into derisive laughter, and they say, there are no moderates. They're all terrorists. And this notion that you can separate out the al-Qaeda ones and you should not fight against them, but we should fight against ISIS simply doesn't make any sense. They all share the same ideology, the same violent terrorist tactics, and they're the same kind of threat, it seems to me, to any civilized person in any country. And I think that's something that the Russians feel much closer to. Right, you know, for them, Syria is 600 miles away. For us, it's 6,000 miles away. There's a huge difference. The other thing, of course, is that they don't have the same love affair with the Saudis and Wahhabism that so much of our establishment does. The Saudis aren't buying billions, tens of billions of dollars of weapons from them or spending billions of dollars to lobby people here in Washington. For the Russians, and I know a lot of people will not take this seriously, part of it has to do with the fact that the Russian Orthodox Church has a very strong influence over government policy. This is not the atheist Soviet Union. The church is a very major and respected force in Russian life today, including something that the government takes heed of, which is why one reason that they have such a conservative social policies compared to what we see in Western Europe and the United States. And when the church says to the government that we are concerned about Christians in Syria, we don't want to see them killed by the jihadists, that's something that the government takes seriously. It seems our government does not.
Well, let me take this opportunity before we wind up about this website you sent me, No Arms for Terrorists.
Yeah.
What is this website? Well, No Arms for Terrorists.
This is a campaign that I'm involved with. You see there, John Eibner. He is the CEO of Christian Solidarity International. This is one of the premier groups that's been around for quite some years to provide aid and assistance to persecuted Christians around the world. Initially, when they started out, largely communist countries, now primarily Muslim countries, although they also still are concerned with countries like, say, China and North Korea and so forth. But it's a group that's been around for a long time, very reputable, and they've decided that this is a key issue right now. This idea that we need to stop supporting terrorists in Syria and Iraq and the purposes and principles behind the Stop Arming Terrorists Act is something they wanted to launch a specific campaign for. So that's what this website is. No Arms for Terrorists, na4t.org.
Okay, well, we'll put this in the hopper. I was Probably in closing, if I can ask about the Qatar, however they say it, a deal where all of a sudden President Trump goes over there and does the little sword dance. He touches the globe of Sauron and all that stuff people had talked about. And then all of a sudden, I don't know if it's days later, all of a sudden Saudi Arabia is cutting off relationships with Qatar and they're supporting terrorism and all this. It just seemed to come out of nowhere, or is it related to this trip, you think?
It's as I used to say back in the Soviet Union, there are no coincidences, comrade. That I don't think is an accident that not too long after President Trump went to Riyadh, that the Saudis, and particularly the Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman, the son of the current king, who's essentially a very doddering old man and incompetent. So Prince Mohammed essentially runs Saudi Arabia. Now, he's the guy responsible for the carnage in Yemen right now, where the Saudis have been just destroying the country, attempting to reinstall their chosen figure there. He's the one who's been very strongly pushing support for these terrorist groups in Syria. And no doubt he felt emboldened by President Trump's mission to try to resolve his outstanding differences with Qatar, a neighboring state. Now, look, in my opinion, the Qataris' hands are not clean either. When the Saudis accuse the Qataris of aiding terrorists, they're right, because the Saudis ought to know, because they aid the very same terrorists. In fact, provide even more aid than the Qataris do. Again, all the Al-Qaeda affiliates and ISIS and so forth. What the Saudis really seem to be miffed about is that the Qataris talk to the Iranians, who the Saudis consider their main enemy, and the Qataris kind of have to do that because they're right across the Persian Gulf from Iran, and they essentially share the same gas field. Whereas Saudi Arabia is primarily an oil power, Qatar is primarily a natural gas power, and they have to cooperate with the Iranians on the exploitation of their joint oil field. The other thing is that the Qataris support the Muslim Brotherhood, a group that I hold in very low regard. I think it's a very bad, dangerous group, but it's the Saudis consider them too dangerously democratic, not in terms of their radical ideology, but in terms of their, let's say, more lower class leanings, as opposed to the privileged monarchical structure you find in Saudi Arabia. The Saudis, in fact, themselves used to provide a lot of aid to the Muslim Brotherhood until they saw the Arab Spring getting this whole populism, overthrow elites thing out of control, and they got cold feet about that and have turned against them. So the Saudis have their own axes to grind with the Qataris. We should keep in mind, by the way, that in the first and second Saudi states, people forget this is the third Saudi state. The first and second ones went defunct in 1818 and 1891. Respectively. What is now Qatar was part of those earlier Saudi states, and I'm sure there are some people in Riyadh, including Prince Mohammed, would love to see them annex Qatar and just add all those gas resources to their portfolio.
Well, after seeing this meeting, Trump sells them billions in weaponry. They cut off Qatar, and I didn't know about them being part of the old Saudi regime, so now it's all starting to gel, and it doesn't look pretty.
The interesting thing there too is that because the Saudis have chosen to go after the Qataris, we're seeing this odd game of musical chairs now in terms of Middle Eastern alignment, because coming now to support the Qataris are the Iranians and also the Turks, who are a Sunni country, but one that has their own problems with the Saudis. They are themselves big supporters of the Muslim Brotherhood. They have a base in Qatar, not too far from where the American base is in Qatar. And of course, Turkey is a NATO member. So things are getting complicated and messy. The Turks have been on the same side as the Qataris and the Saudis as far as Syria goes, but now we see them working more closely with the Russians and the Iranians, partly because they're less concerned about Assad now and more concerned about the Kurds. So things change.
All right. Well, is there anything we missed? Because that you want to add in here before we go?
The only thing I would like to add is that I hope your viewers will take a look at the na4t.org page and check in with their representative, their congressmen and their senators about support for the Stop Arming Terrorists Act. That's a very important piece of legislation. We're not, from the point of view of our campaign, we're less focused on the bill itself than on the purposes behind it. The United States should not be giving weapons to Al-Qaeda, to ISIS, and the groups that are allied with them. I mean, you'd think it wouldn't take an act of Congress to do that, but it turns out we do.
Yeah.
So if people can focus on that issue and read that article, read the article by Gareth Porter in the American Conservative, because I think it's an essential piece of public awareness.
Well, I appreciate you being here with us, and I like your availability, and I can predict that we'll probably be talking more because things probably will get worse before they get better, if they get better. But people can subscribe on Twitter to you at Jim Jatras and get your information as it comes out. And I appreciate that information. So we will talk again, and thanks for taking some time with us.
Thank you. Appreciate it.